Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out the first of my previews for patch 9.2 of Shadowlands. The big patch announcement came out a couple of days ago, and one of the biggest features Blizzard announced that I think will affect things for players in a pretty big way is the ability to equip 2 legendaries at once. Now, I saw this coming from the moment they announced Shadowlands and said that legendaries were going to be a game feature for this expansion. Of course, we're going to get to equip 2 at some point. What I wasn't expecting, even until the announcement, is that one of those 2 legendaries has to be a Covenant-specific legendary. That's going to constrain things, but with Covenants now being freely swappable, I don't necessarily think that it will be bad for the health of the game. Just looking at this from a tank perspective, I think there are some classes like Bear Druid, for example, that immediately become way better than every other class in the game if they're able to wear 2 synergizing non-Covenant legendaries, both of the Thrash legendaries. That would be incredibly powerful, but to the point of being kind of broken. I mean, I guess hypothetically they could try to balance around that. I just don't think they will. So, the idea of a Covenant legendary and a non-Covenant legendary might wind up changing to just being 2 of any kind of legendary, and I think the community feedback is going to be a constant rallying cry around that idea. But I would say this: don't expect this to happen. If it does, it probably wouldn't be until the patch has been out for 6 months, or maybe even during the next expansion's pre-patch. There are some other new system additions that we haven't yet been given any real details about, such as tier sets, the continued expansion of the Conduit and Soulbind system, although I guess we've been told that's really not going to be going anywhere other than just more item levels for Conduits, but we don't even know how many more item levels. Class balancing changes, and the new First One's language thing that I don't really understand. But what I do want to do with the rest of this video is go over the 6 tanks and each of their 4 Covenant legendaries and talk about what I think could be really powerful synergies that might shake up the state of the game. Basically, this creates 24 distinct builds for tanks, 6 classes, 4 Covenants, quick math, that's 24. And, I think that there are some tanks that could see serious jumps up in popularity. I think there are some underused Covenants that could see a lot more popularity, and I think there are some of the more popular setups that might drop off quite a bit. So, just to go through this alphabetically, we'll start with Death Knight. DK has 2 popular legendaries right now. Super Strain, which is a really basic passive bonus. It isn't bad, it gives you extra damage, which is good, and it gives you occasional runic power procs from Frost Fever, which is also good. I would say this bonus is good, it's just boring also. Crimson Rune Weapon is the other one, and it's a much more defensive bonus, and it is more active. But because it requires you to consistently consume bone charges for it to do, what it does, that means you need to be constantly tanking to get full value out of it. So I think it's generally a better defensive choice for early in the season pushing Mythic Plus or progression raid tank in really tough fights. That was certainly the case in patch 9.1, but beyond that, I've found it really just gets set aside for the extra threat, damage, and consistency of Super Strain. And just to cover my bases, the Death Grip legendary that I don't even remember the name of, even though I've looked it up and written it down, that also gets used in raids just to have more grips available. It's basically only used for fights where you need grips. It's an encounter design thing, and I don't really think it's a factor here. I'm just mentioning it so that no one can chime in the comments section saying that I forgot it. I didn't forget, it's just boring. I don't think any of this is going to change. I think Super Strain will probably remain the default legendary for Blood DK in the next patch, probably right from the start, with Crimson Rune Weapon never really jumping back up over it again. When it comes to Covenants, again, I think we should just go alphabetically. Kyrian DK got a buff in patch 9.1.5, with Shackle the Unworthy now having a 100% chance to spread when you hit the target with a rune spending ability, and that's a buff up from 50% chance. This is great, and it synergizes really nicely with Final Sentence, which refunds a rune and gives you a stacking damage buff every time Shackle spreads to a new target. But here's the problem. All of this does literally nothing in single target, and it's not very competitive in all-out AoE. So this winds up being extremely useful in the new raid, Sepulchre of the First Ones, if there are like 2 to 3 to 4 target cleave fights. If there aren't, it's kind of useless. If that were to happen, I think the potential defensive synergy between Final Sentence and Crimson Rune Weapon could be very, very nice, and I think it could make Kyrian Blood DKs insanely self-sufficient for extremely specific tanking situations. But otherwise, this one's kind of disappointing, and I think this is the kind of thing that maybe like a couple of World First guilds are going to be affected by, and that's about it. The Necrolord DK Legendary, Abomination's Frenzy, was considered really underwhelming when it was announced, and I think that's the right take. Giving up Super Strain for this would suck, but getting both of them together really boosts Blood DK's AoE damage and threat potential in Mythic Plus and AoE. The added Bone Shield charges really aren't a huge deal, but a bit more defensive value and leeway is not a bad thing. The real value here, I think, is just that Necrolord Blood DK is going to be even more powerful for doing big chunks of burst damage in Mythic Plus, or on fights where there's like a sudden explosion of adds that you have to like grip in and burn down, and then you go back to just sort of a boring single target fight, kind of like Soul Render Dormazane has been in Sanctum of Domination. I think it's just going to reinforce Necrolord as even more of the meta choice for high-level pushing, and for low-level speedrunning. In Mythic Plus, obviously. Night Fae DKs have had a couple of moments during beta and PTR testing throughout the Shadowlands where they seem like they could be good, but it hasn't ever really materialized. Being able to benefit from both Super Strain and Rampant Transference at the same time could be very good. As good as the constant bonus of strength and damage reduction is, as well as the really nice synergy with Naya's Grove Invigoration, I think this setup is going to be hampered by the simplicity of Death's Due. It's very easy to play. I think depending on how the fight design of the next tier is, it could be really good. If there's an encounter that features just constantly high damage, I think that this being a constant bonus could be very valuable. If the encounters are more like they were in Sanctum of Domination and Castle Nathria, where there's a, periodic, whatever, decent amounts of damage, but really it's big bursts of damage, I think that the bigger burstier Covenant abilities, Venthyr and Necrolord, are going to have more of an impact. I think for Mythic Plus, again, I think this is a good bonus, a fine one. The runic power generation is certainly nice. It just doesn't have that big, you snap your fingers and there's a giant cooldown going off. It's just sort of, you kind of are a little bit stronger all the time. It doesn't really work as well with the way the game is played right now. And moving on to Venthyr DK, I think they're similar to Necrolord DK, but a little bit less large of bursts, but more often. Insatiable Hunger isn't really a great legendary power on its own, but it will add a bunch of burst damage onto your Covenant ability, and I think that's good. The problem with it is that it has a direct overlap with the Necrolord setup, and while it's active twice as often and will provide more consistent damage output and defensive value throughout combat, it's also not giving a bunch of death grips for free. So if you have a situation where you need to do AoE damage, but for some reason you don't need a bunch of death grips together, then I think Venthyr would make more sense as a better choice. Otherwise, it's so hard to outperform Necrolord DK. It's just the death grips are incredible in almost every AoE situation. So in the case of Blood DK, I think that the Necrolord and Venthyr legendaries are going to keep both of those covenants as generally the most popular choices. The Kyrian and Night Fae ones are interesting and could be situationally good, but they're definitely not going to have the same all-purpose appeal that Necrolord and Venthyr do, and that probably won't cause... I think that popularity with DK will stay the same. I don't think there's going to be any real shift in the patch, at least not because of this system. Next up is Demon Hunter, and I think it might be the biggest beneficiary of this new setup of any class. Demon Hunter has a few legendary options that are popular for them right now. Fiery Soul is the go-to defensive legendary. It offers a massive increase in Fiery Brand uptime, like more than double, which really helps boost the class's defenses and tanking in every environment. Mythic Plus, rating, yeah, that's pretty much it. It's a great defensive bonus, one of the best available to any tank. There's also Razlik's Defilement, which has terrific synergy with Kyrian's Elysian Decree. It cuts its cooldown by roughly 15 to 20 seconds, which is a pretty substantial DPS increase. This is mostly a raid DPS legendary, but it's very good at adding damage in raids. And finally, Dark Glare Boon is a really popular legendary in Mythic Plus. It adds a nice blend of offensive and defensive value, and when it procs, it's a lot more noticeable while AoE tanking than Fiery Soul is, but it's also a lot less consistent. It's a good all-around Mythic Plus legendary. I would say I use all three of these legendaries, depending on, you know, I use Fiery Soul on Sylvanas still. I use Razlik's Defilement on pretty much everything else in Raid. And Dark Glare Boon I use pretty much exclusively in Mythic Plus. Kyrian Demon Hunter's legendary got a very nice buff in patch 9.1.5, with Blind Faith being changed to grant versatility instead of mastery. Blind Faith had already been seeing an increase in popularity in Mythic Plus due to its use in the MDI. It's a good legendary. It's not a consistent defensive bonus like Fiery Soul, and it's not a random offensive and defensive bonus like Dark Glare Boon, but it is great for Mythic Plus pushing, and it synergizes unbelievably well with Razlik's Defilement. Those two legendary powers combined with the cooldown reduction from Mechanicos' final soulbound power, effusive anima accelerator, should make Kyrian Vengeance Demon Hunter insanely strong in patch 9.2. This is one of the best bits of synergy that any tank is going to get from the new 2 legendary system. It's amazing, and the versatility buff is probably strong enough to make running this pair of bonuses, even though they're a little bit more offensive than Fiery Soul, viable defensively in both Mythic Plus pushing and progression rating. The amount of versatility is pretty substantial, and it's going to have pretty high uptime. I'm very excited for this setup in patch 9.2 right now, in case you can't tell. I've played around with some sims, and I don't think any sim values should be given much credit right now, but in AoE, this setup was simming as a 30% DPS increase over just running Razlik's Defilement alone. Very exciting. Next up is Necrolord DH, which hasn't really been popular up to this point, and I don't see that changing with the patch, but there is one potential synergy that I think is interesting. Running Demonic Oath gives you a short AoE Fiery Brand when your Necrolord Demon explodes, and that Fodder to the Flame Demon is a random proc with a proc rate of about 1.5 procs per minute, so this adds like 7.5 seconds of Fiery Brand uptime per minute in AoE. That's not great on its own, but when you combine it with Fiery Soul's incredible Fiery Brand uptime increase, I think it's okay. Just to use my own data as a comparison, I average like 75% Fiery Brand uptime while actively tanking Painsmith and Sylvanas, and this bonus could bump that up even further. It's not great, but I think there's some potential for Necrolord DH to not be a complete joke in some situations. The real problem with it is that it's totally RNG, so you might get procs when you're not actively tanking, or you're in a transition phase, and so I just think this probably never winds up being good at all, especially considering it's sitting next to Kyrian DH, which currently looks insanely overpowered. Night Fae is up next, and I would say there's basically zero synergy here. It's really not even that Blazing Slaughter is bad. It's a fine bonus. The Hunt is a fine ability, but none of these abilities synergize with other Vengeance powers, so I think it's going to wind up pretty much never getting any usage. Finally, Venthyr DH got a buff in patch 9.1.5, with Sinful Brand's cooldown getting cut down to 45 seconds. With the Fell Devastation cooldown reduction conduit and with Dark Glare Boon, that means that Fell Devastation pretty much lines up with Sinful Brand, and with the Sinful Brand legendary causing Fell Devastation damage to extend Sinful Brand, you know, there's pretty decent synergy there. Being able to extend the duration of Sinful Brand, you know, potentially by a lot if you get good Dark Glare Boon proc RNG, could be really nice. There's potential there for this to be an amazing setup, but it's predicated on good RNG. And other than every 3 minutes when meta is up to apply Sinful Brand to a pack of enemies, this is really only going to work as a single target DPS increase. Because of that, I just don't think this mostly single target focused RNG based setup is going to be able to compete with the consistent high damage and stat budget granted in both single target and AoE by the new and really impressive Kyrian setup. Alright, next up is Druid, and I think we could see a ton of movement here. In Mythic Plus, Ursoc's Fury Remembered has been the go-to choice for pretty much all of the expansion. There's not really any alternative here, and for good reason, it's incredible. In raids, you have several options. Ursoc's Fury still provides a decent blend of AoE damage and defensive value, but given that a lot of fights in Sanctum of Domination have mostly been single target or burst ad cleave with kind of low uptime on the ads, you know, Soul Render Dormazane, for example, it's not great. Draft of Deep Focus is the best single target DPS legendary, there's no debate there. For druids who are in farm or for tanking stuff that isn't very threatening and they're doing a lot of cat weaving, that's what you use. If you are tanking stuff that's really dangerous, the Natural Order's Will, aka the Barkskin legendary, is a really terrific defensive option for those hard-hitting bosses. And with Conduits presumably gaining a bunch more ranks, the Barkskin Conduit is going to lower Barkskin's cooldown by another like 2 to 5 seconds, which should make it even stronger. And that actually is a perfect segue into Kyrian Druid. Now, I'll be honest and say I hated this ability during the Shadowlands beta. I hated this ability all the way basically up until, I don't know, the last couple of weeks. I thought it was the worst Covenant ability. I still don't really love it on its own. I recently tried to explain how Kindred Spirits works to someone, and it took about 5 or 6 attempts for them to completely wrap their head around it. It's just too complicated for such a small bonus. But it is very versatile, and with the combination of the Conduit, which reduces its cooldown, and Mechanicos, who reduces its cooldown, you can bring the average cooldown of Kindred Spirits into the 30-second range. When you factor in, again, higher Conduit levels in patch 9.2, that winds up being more like the 25-second range. When you factor in the Barkskin Conduit levels, that's also in the 25-second range. When you factor in Kindred Affinity, the Kyrian Druid legendary, that's an extra 16% of a secondary stat up half the time, and 8% when it's not up. So here's what this all means. Kyrian Bear Druid will probably be the tankiest raid tank since Brewmasters and Mists of Pandaria. Being able to have like 80 to 90% uptime on at least one major defensive cooldown, a massive boost to probably versatility or haste, all the extra damage from Mechanicos triggering every 25 to 30 seconds, and all the defensive value you're going to be granting your empowered ally is really going to add up. Kyrian Bear Druid, I can't believe I'm going to say it, looks really, really good. Now on to Necrolord Druid, and I'm not feeling it. Sorry, I liked Necrolord Druid back in the beta. I like the way that it plays, and I like the concept. The idea of an ability that alternates between dealing damage and healing is thematically neat. I just simply had the worry that it would never wind up being balanced very well, and unfortunately, it has never wound up being balanced very well. This bonus adds a good bit of value in cleave situations. I mean, I think that the legendary probably should just be baseline. Having a chance to split, I think that's pretty cool. I don't know what a new legendary would be, but there you go. As a result, I just don't think that the base power of Llarold Druid is going to be strong enough to compete with any of the other covenants. I think Llarold Druid, last place. Night Fae has been the most popular Bear Druid covenant throughout Shadowlands for a few reasons. Obviously, it's the one that makes the most thematic sense, and I like that, but that really doesn't wind up mattering that much to top-end players when it comes to choosing what's best for competitive play. And that tends to filter down to the rest of the community. Night Fae has been good because Convoke the Spirits adds a ton of damage, either single target damage in Raid while you're in Cat form, or AoE damage in Mythic Plus while you're in Moonkin form. It can be used as a really strong emergency defensive cooldown in Bear form, although you hate to give up the damage, or even as an amazing Raid healing cooldown in Caster form. It's great. It's versatile, and that's great too, but I think it's getting competition from both sides. Kyrian Druid looks like it's going to be providing a lot more consistent group utility than Night Fae, and more defensive value in Raid. I'll get to Vinthyr in a moment, but just to spoil it, I think there's 100% chance it's going to provide more offensive value in Mythic Plus. I think Night Fae will still have great value for doing damage in raids, and I still think it's very, very good. Celestial Spirits adds more overall damage into using Convoke throughout the fight, and it cuts the cooldown in half. That means you're basically going to get twice as much value out of Naya's Grove Inspiration, which is terrific. You're definitely going to get a lot more damage out of Cat Weaving in raids, and even Owl Weaving in Mythic Plus. And I definitely think that this is just a terrific buff to an already excellent covenant for Druids. But it's not as new and cool and interesting as Kyrian Druid, and it's good, but it's a little less exciting than I think Vinthyr Bear Druid is going to be in Mythic Plus. I could see Night Fae remaining the #1 most popular Bear Covenant for all content. I could see it dropping to #2 in Raid and #3 in Mythic Plus. I don't know. Anything is possible. And finally, Vinthyr Druid. Vinthyr Druid has been able to deal the most damage while in Bear form of any Covenant, with the problem of being the least versatile covenant for Druids by far. It's great for adding tons of damage during Incarnation, it's really tanky, and the burst damage there is incredible. Adding Sinful Hysteria onto that is going to make it just much stronger during that burst every 3 minutes. There's a potential case for running Legacy of the Sleeper instead of Ursoc's Fury just to increase your power during that 2 cooldown period. It does give up some obvious direct shielding value, and obviously a bunch of value in between the 150 seconds where your cooldowns are not up. And also, it would basically waste all of the cooldown reduction that you get out of Legacy of the Sleeper. You don't want to desync those 2 major cooldowns. That being said, if you are running Legacy of the Sleeper and Sinful Hysteria together, you're going to deal absolutely insane amounts of damage while those cooldowns are up. Insane. So I almost think that there's a chance that that setup could get run, probably in MDI, where groups will pull literally all of the trash that's in between bosses on a tyrannical dungeon, do it all in a single pull with those 2 overlapping abilities, and then spend, the next 2.5 minutes doing the boss, rinse and repeat. Maybe. I don't really think that Vinthyr Bear is going to be very good at all in raids, though. I mean, I think realistically the more logical setup is going to be still running Ursoc's Fury and then Sinful Hysteria, kind of the standard setup, which should be great, but given that it is more cooldown-ish than Kyrian's more consistent defensive and offensive value, or even Night Fae's more consistent offensive value, I think that Vinthyr Bear is pretty much going to be a Mythic Plus only type of deal. Night Fae should still deal way more damage in raids. Kyrian's going to be much tankier. Mythic Plus, Vinthyr Bear, that's where it's at. Alright, now let's move on to Monk. Monk has 2 legendaries of note. Stormstout's Last Keg, which is better for AoE damage, a bit more bursty, and tends toward a slightly more defensive playstyle, and Charred Passions, which adds more consistent damage, especially in single target, but promotes a playstyle that's a little less defensive. Both of these bonuses are great. I would love to be able to run them both together, and really that's probably my biggest complaint with the way that they're implementing 2 legendaries as a system. As a Kyrian Monk, you're going to have to run Call to Arms, which summons Nuzal the Black Ox for 12 seconds. Call to Arms is not a bad bonus, but it's also not a good bonus. Nuzal's damage output is almost entirely dependent on the amount of staggered damage you purify while he's active. If you're taking something really hard-hitting like Enraging Fortified Trash or a dangerous raid boss, his damage can be extremely high. And as a result, this bonus would be very strong. Unfortunately, if you're not taking a lot of damage, such as during a taunt swap or while you're kiting in Mythic Plus, or tanking a boss during a fortified week, his damage output's going to be pretty low. And because the main thing he offers is damage, that makes this bonus pretty weak. Sims are not to be trusted, especially at this point, and I do have confirmation from one of the Simcraft developers that it's an API problem. But my first sim of running Call to Arms with a Stormstout's Last Keg reported a DPS increase of 2. Yes, 2, not 2%, just 2 DPS. Again, that number's wrong. It's really just more about, you know, the way it feels to see the number 2 next to a sim. It won't be that bad. At times it can be extremely good. Like, sometimes Call to Arms can add more damage than Stormstout's Last Keg or Charred Passions. But it's not reliable, and that's really unfortunate considering the main selling point of Kyrian Monk throughout the entire expansion has been exactly that. It's not always the best in every situation, but it is always very consistent and very competitive, and this legendary is not. It undermines that aspect of Kyrian Monk. On the subject of being inconsistent, Necrolord Monk's legendary power is too. It's bad. I tested this during the patch 9.1 PTR and determined that it could not proc while Bone Dust Brew was active. I hope I'm not missing something here. Maybe I am, let me know in the comments. But at the time, and having tested again since, it has a listed proc rate of 1.5 procs per minute. The issue is that because it can't proc while Bone Dust Brew is active, that basically cuts the proc chance in half, which makes this bonus awful. 1 proc of Bone Dust Brew every 90 seconds? Horrible. If they do some work on this legendary to make it more consistent, make it able to proc while Bone Dust Brew is active, and not overwrite the duration, you know, you don't want to throw Bone Dust Brew down, get 1 second of it out, have it proc again, now it's at 10 seconds again. You want it to extend. If they work that out and it all works correctly, I think this bonus would be great. And I think Necrolord Monk would basically take Kyrian Monk's place as the most consistent, most powerful Brewmaster option. That would require tuning from Blizzard on this legendary though, and I don't expect that to happen. Nightfey Monk, which I've been trying off and on to make work since the Shadowlands beta, actually gets a pretty nice buff with this legendary system change. The big problem with Nightfey Monk is that you have to fight on the Fey line to get resets, and Fey line Harmony really helps make that less irritating by doubling the reset frequency. This makes Nightfey Monk a lot less punishing. What I found when I was playing around with Nightfey Monk after finishing Sanctum of Domination Prog was that I could consistently maintain 10 to 15 stacks of Naya's Grove Invigoration, which is really amazing. Even with as good as Mechanicos is, there's no Soulbind power that can compete with a constant 10 to 15% increased maximum health and 250 to 400 mastery. It's incredible. On top of that, the mobility granted by Soul Shape is also really, really good. It really helped reduce my reliance on Blessings of Protection while doing Painsmith on farm for the first couple of weeks. It made picking up soul fragments on Kel'Thuzad a lot easier. Again, sims are not to be trusted, but I simmed around a 10 to 15% increase in DPS by running Night Fae Monk with both Phaeline Harmony and Storm Stout's Last Keg, as opposed to running just Storm Stout's Last Keg. It was about 10% in single target and 15% in AoE. That's pretty good. It's not insane like Kyrian DH, but it is at least interesting. The biggest problem I ran into when I was playing Night Fae Monk was having to sacrifice Storm Stout's Last Keg or Charred Passions in order to run Phaeline Harmony. And by removing that restriction, I think Night Fae Monk really jumps up a lot in value. I'm not delusional. I don't think it's going to overtake Kyrian Monk because I don't think it's going to have the same level of single target damage output. And I don't even know that it's going to outperform Necrolord Monk because, again, there's a lot of consistent defensive value there, even with their crappy broken legendary. It's also just not nearly as easy to play as those other two due to having a positional requirement thanks to the Fey line. But I think it's going to become a much more competitive option due to being able to equip 2 legendaries and the Night Fae legendary actually being pretty consistent and pretty good. Lastly, Venthyr Monk was a Covenant class combo I've made fun of since the start of the expansion for being totally awful and unpopular because of that awfulness, but with the addition of Sinister Teachings, Mistweavers have basically all gone vampire mode. And for good reason, this is a terrific bonus if you can get consistent crits while Fallen Order is active. The problem is that while Mistweavers can easily guarantee enough crits to consistently reduce Fallen Order's cooldown from 3 minutes to under 60 seconds, Brewmasters and Windwalkers don't have that luxury. Unless you have a very big AoE pack around you that you're constantly spinning Crane Kicking or Keg Smashing and rushing Jadewinding, getting enough consistent crits just isn't possible, and the value of this legendary winds up being really low. Once you factor in the value of Fallen Order also being kind of mediocre for Brewmasters, it's basically just an extra Nizhao that doesn't scale its damage up in any cool way with Stagger and Purify like he does. I think Venthyr Brewmaster still winds up being a totally unplayed, uninteresting setup. Alright, let's move on to Paladin. Paladin basically has 2 good legendary options in Mythic Plus, depending on whether you're Kyrian or something else, and really only 1 good option in Raid. Paladins typically gear for damage output because their damage scaling is so strong. While you can run some of the more defensively oriented options during progression raiding, I think you're really just so much better off playing a different tank than playing a Pally and then not trying to deal damage. So for Mythic Plus, the 2 best options are Bulwark of Righteous Fury if you're not Kyrian, and Divine Resonance if you are. Divine Resonance adds damage, defense, and utility by casting a bunch of extra Avenger shields. And Bulwark just turns using Avenger Shield into more damage on your Shield of the Righteous. It's just damage. But it is a lot of damage. In raids, it's basically just the Mad Paragon, which adds a ton of damage, and Avenging Wrath uptime, which is also more damage. And some Kyrian Pallies will still run Divine Resonance in raids just because it's simple and they're comfortable with it, but really, now that Covenant swapping is free, I think you're best off always going Venthyr and using Mad Paragon for raids, and Kyrian with Divine Resonance for Mythic Plus. It's kind of incredible that one class has 2 of the strongest tanks in the game, as long as you're willing to do the work to swap and maintain 2 Covenants. Kyrian Pally is insanely strong in Mythic Plus. Just being able to AoE Avenger Shield is good enough, but factor in that you're going to be able to combine the consistent power of Divine Resonance with Bulwark of Righteous Fury, and Kyrian Prop Pally damage in Mythic Plus is going to become a problem. Seriously, I expect 5 Kyrian Prop Pally Mythic Plus meme teams. I expect Kyrian Prop Pally times all Mythic Plus dungeons on 15 to be a WoW head post at some point during the patch. And most of all, I expect some kind of nerfs, but until that point, this is going to absolutely dominate in Mythic Plus. Necrolord Paladin has been buffed a couple of times, and the problem with it is that it still sucks. A free Shield of the Righteous every 30 seconds is fine. It's actually mathematically pretty good defensively. The damage output in single target is fine. And getting a second charge of your Covenant ability is also fine. It's just nowhere close to competitive offensively with Kyrian or Venthyr, and the defensive value isn't good enough to matter either. This sucks. Night Fae Paladin has been pretty bad since they nerfed it at the end of the beta, by adding 15 seconds onto the cooldown of Blessing of Seasons, which effectively cut its uptime by 50%. This legendary bonus doesn't do anything to move the needle at all. It's absolutely never competitive, you shouldn't play it ever. If you really want to be a buff machine as a tank, Necrolord Warrior and Kyrian Druid are so much better at providing group value and being useful tanks still than a Night Fae prop pally. This sucks, let's move on. To Venthyr pally, which is still incredibly overpowered. It's insane how good it is at dealing damage as a tank. Radiant Embers adds an extra 15 seconds onto Ashen Hollow's duration, which sounds pretty good on paper, and in practice, it's okay. The extra damage is good, it's free real estate, but it's also 15 extra seconds of Ashen Hollow after wings have faded, after your trinkets have faded, after your potion is faded, after, I don't know, other buffs have faded. Not Lust, though. Extending out to 40 seconds does make it cover a full Bloodlust, so that's nice at least, but still, it winds up lasting a lot longer than the rest of your overlapping cooldowns, and it just isn't as good as it looks like it would be at first glance. Being able to move out early in order to reduce the cooldown of Ashen Hollow sounds useful, but lining up your other cooldowns becomes a lot more complicated, and the potential to unintentionally end your Ashen Hollow way early is really irritating. Venthyr Pally is going to remain incredibly powerful in raids due to their ability to basically be an extra DPS player while still also being a decent tank with incredible group utility. Adding Radiant Embers into this mix definitely doesn't hurt, but it's not like a huge boost either. Certainly, Venthyr Pally isn't gaining the kind of extra juice in raids that Kyrian DH is, or even Kyrian Pally is in Mythic Plus. And finally, we have Warrior. Warrior has had exactly 2 good legendaries for all of patch 9.1, Reprisal and the Wall. Reprisal is better. It adds more rage, it adds more defensive value and more offensive value, and generally it's a cooler option, but it can also be pretty annoying to use effectively, especially in raids. The Wall just adds rage and cooldown reduction onto Shield Wall, and it's about as easy to use as eating ice cream. They're both good. Prob Warrior hasn't been popular throughout Shadowlands because frankly it's just not that sexy. The damage is low, the damage reduction against blockable and reflectable damage is incredible, best in the game, but against unblockable, not reflectable damage, such as bleeds and dots, the class is kind of underwhelming. Castle Nathria was full of bleeds, Sanctum of Domination is full of dots, and Warriors have just done the same thing that Brewmasters and Bear Druids do, but worse. But all that changes now, maybe, but also probably not. Let's start with Kyrian. The Kyrian Legendary, which I have forgotten the name of, adds 4 seconds onto Spear of Bastion, which makes it even stronger for rooting enemies that leap around in Mythic Plus, and it also just boosts the damage by a good bit. I really like this Legendary's Fury and Arms, it's very nice, and the Synergy and Torghast, for what that's worth, which won't be much in patch 9.2, has been pretty fun. Having spears that last for like 45 seconds is just very funny. That being said, this is just a decent damage boost, nothing transformational or very interesting. It's underwhelming, and while Kyrian Warriors have been good thus far in Shadowlands, and they're pretty fun to play, to me at least, I don't think this really does anything to make them gain any sort of real new strength in patch 9.2. Necrolord Warriors up next, and Glory, the Necrolord legendary that was introduced in patch 9.1, is easily my favorite of all the Warrior Covenant legendaries as protection. I really wanted to make this bonus work. I spent a bunch of time playing around with it, and I think it really helped solve a lot of my major problems with the design of Necrolord Warrior's banner during the Shadowlands beta and the first half of patch 9.0. This is like whatever a design tangent, but hear me out. The problem with choosing a group buff as a Covenant ability is the sacrifice. Like, I don't think the current buff matrix system of abilities like Power Word, Fortitude, Battle Shout, and so on is good for the health of the game. It forces you to bring the corresponding classes into any competitive raid environment, but as it's currently designed, Battle Shout just as a skill on its own is fine. It's 5% more attack power for all the people who use attack power. That's cool. If you had to choose Battle Shout out of a talent tier that had Avatar next to it, where you're choosing between buffing the group's damage or having an offensive cooldown, you'd be forced into taking Battle Shout, and you would hate it. I would hate it. That's what being a Necrolord Warrior in the early pre-buff version of this was, and even the current version of Necrolord Warrior without glory to a lesser extent. The big positives I found of testing glory back in the patch 9.1 PTR was that you could realistically extend the duration of your personal banner buff to anywhere from 45 to like 80 or 90 seconds. And applying the buff to a third target is immensely valuable when it comes to boosting your party members' DPS. The problem with that setup was pretty simple. You have to give up Reprisal or the Wall. That's a big defensive sacrifice. Now that you can have both, I think Necrolord Prot Warrior has really strong potential to be a competitive choice for boosting group utility. It's still never going to do as much damage as Kyrian or Night Fae Warrior, so like for Mythic Plus, it might not be worth using. It depends on your group. Certainly for any, world questing, it's going to be worse. But the group value in raids will probably wind up outweighing all of the personal sacrifices by a pretty substantial margin. I could see Necrolord Prot Warrior getting a lot of use in the upcoming raid, particularly for high level, world firsty type of guilds. Night Fae Warrior, like Kyrian Warrior, gains damage output. Nature's Fury adds an extra tick onto Ancient Aftershock, which is a decent DPS increase, but it's not really very interesting otherwise. It's not bad, it's just kinda boring. And finally, here we are at the end. Venthyr Protection Warrior. It's still bad. Sinful Surge was redesigned to grant Avatar uptime instead of Last Stand uptime when you use Condemn while it's active. And that's nice, but it's also still pretty bad. The potential overlap there, even in the absolute best case scenario, it's kind of weak, and the best case scenario just isn't, typical. Yeah, Venthyr never got balanced to be remotely competitive for Protection Warriors. Who could have seen this coming? Patch 9.2 is coming, and it's bringing a lot of new interesting stuff with it. We've only seen the tip of the iceberg so far, but honestly, it has been really exciting. We can't wait to see the rest of the updates and break them down as they come out. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about tanks in Shadowlands Patch 9.2 or Patch 9.1.5, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thank you for watching. Bye.